Yeah, it's
Okay, welcome everybody. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me out there? Great. I think we're going to go ahead and try to get started here. We believe there are still people trying to find where Baker is, which is not as well known to the broader Yale community yet as it is to our law students. I'd like to welcome you to the first speaker series event of the year that's put on by the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale, also known as LEAP. Tonight's event is a great one, and it reflects our ambition to situate thinking about non-human animals and our responsibilities to them in context with other vital matters of ethics and law and policy. For many years, the subject of animal law was a pretty niche one that focused on topics like who gets to keep the dog in a divorce proceeding. LEAP instead is committed to the idea that how we treat non-human animals holds broader implications for how we relate to our fellow humans, for the health of the planet, for the intellectual foundation of our ethics and our legal system. A lot of the work we do at LEAP currently focuses on industrial animal agriculture and its major role in driving climate change and deforestation, which are planetary scale changes that raise risk for all of us. Tonight's panel looks at animal protection alongside another pressing and vast social ill, the failings and atrocities of the carceral state. The motivating event for the panel is the release of a new volume from Cambridge University Press called Carceral Logics, which explores the intersection of issues that arise in thinking about animal law, violence, mass incarceration, and social change. It's a remarkable interdisciplinary volume that I recommend to anyone who's interested in thinking about oppression and how to overcome it. It's also a volume that's available for free online due to the generous support of the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to acknowledge and appreciate our co-sponsors, which are the Arthur Lyman Center for Public Interest Law, the Justice Collaboratory, the Yale Animal Law Society, Yale Environmental Humanities, the Yale Environmental Law Association, and the Yale Sustainable Food Program. And finally, if you're interested in becoming a member of the LEAP community, please sign up for our listserv to receive event announcements, and also consider applying to become a LEAP student fellow. Our executive director, Viveka Morris, can provide you with more info after the panel. So the speakers we have tonight are really a remarkable group of people, and I'm going to give probably longer introductions than they'll like to hear, but I'm going to do it anyways. Lori Gruen is the William Griffin Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies and Science and Society at Wesleyan University. She also coordinates there the Wesleyan Animal Studies program. Her work lies at the intersection of ethical and political theory and practice. She has a particular focus on issues that impact those who are often overlooked in traditional ethical investigations, such as women and people of color and incarcerated people and non-human animals. Her philosophical scholarship is filled with analytical touchstones like dignity, self-respect, empathy, and hope, the same touchstones that she brings to her classrooms, to her advocacy outside of the academy, and to her daily practice of living a life filled with compassion and depth. Justin Marceau comes from the University of Denver, where he's professor of law and serves as the Brooks Institute Faculty Research Scholar of Animal Law and Policy. That is a mouthful, Justin.
Yes, it really is.
He's faculty director of the Animal Law program, and he's also an affiliated faculty member with the Institute for Human-Animal Connections at the Graduate School of Social Work there. Justin is an expert in animal law, criminal law, and constitutional law. He's a former federal public defender who specialized in capital cases. More than anyone else in the academy or in the animal protection movement, Justin's work has elevated the question of whether the movement is normatively and practically justified in relying as it does so heavily on criminal and carceral strategies. In addition to his accomplishments as a scholar, Justin's the recipient of numerous awards for his service, including the Justice for Animals Award and the Colorado Criminal Defense Bar's Gideon Award. Also on our panel tonight is Michael Braham, who is a paralegal and currently a fellow in the Access to Law program at Yale Law School's Law and Racial Justice Center. Formerly incarcerated activist who fights for criminal justice reform in Connecticut, Michael works with Stop Solitary Connecticut, an organization that aims to end the use of solitary confinement statewide and replace isolation with humane, safe, and effective alternatives. While in prison, Michael started an organization aimed at promoting higher education within disadvantaged communities. Since his release, he's expanding the scope of this organization to include a full-service community center, which will provide a safe haven for at-risk youth. He's also been working with Lori and Justin as a member of the Alternatives to Cruelty Response Working Group. In his undergraduate career, Michael was a student at Wesleyan Middlesex's Center for Prison Education, where he majored in philosophy with a focus on the intersection between critical race theory and sociology, and where, if I'm not mistaken, he may have taken a class with Lori.
5.
Finally, Dwayne Betts is, Dwayne Betts is Dwayne Betts. Poet, lawyer, visionary, executive director of Freedom Reads, a nonprofit organization that's radically transforming access to literature in prisons across the country. Dwayne's own contributions, of course, to literature and the arts are immense. The author of a memoir, 3 collections of poetry. He's transformed his latest collection of poetry, which was the American Book Award-winning book Felon, into a solo theater show that explores the post-incarceration experience and the lingering consequences of a criminal record. In 2019, Dwayne won the National Magazine Award in the Essays and Criticism category for his essay that chronicled his journey from prison to becoming a licensed attorney. Among his innumerable distinctions, he's been a Radcliffe Fellow for Harvard, a Guggenheim Fellow, an Emerson Fellow at New America, a Civil Society Fellow at Aspen, and of course, also a MacArthur Genius Fellow. Dwayne, you might want to try out to be a LEAP Fellow. I think you'd have a strong application.
Yeah.
So I believe we're going to hear first from Justin.
Sure. Well, thank you, Doug, and thanks everyone for being here. It's great to be with you all. We're just going to sort of talk. I mean, we did want to talk about the book and what we were trying to do with it. We wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, but I thought I would give a little bit of context for why we wrote the book, but also like sort of what's going on in sort of the modern moment. I just got this Florida Bar Journal this week. But I'd start by just sort of saying, for those of you who've thought about animal law, I think even Doug might have this in his chapter in the book, but Claude Lévi-Strauss is famous for saying, he's either quoted or misquoted, and my French isn't good enough to know, but that animals are good to think with. He also says to eat with, or to eat. But his point here, I think, is that by meditating on or about animals, we can learn a lot about the human condition. We can learn a lot about ourselves and our own essence. And I've always thought that was true of the law as well, that even when it was a fringe field, even when it was a topic that, sort of being derided as, well, is this the law of the horse and this kind of thing, animals always gave us the chance to think about the law and see these gaps. And so we can kind of think about what we're doing at the intersection of animals and the law and learn a lot about the law itself and sort of where the justices and the progressions are. And that's one of the reasons I think Lori and I wanted to put together this book, is thinking about how animal law intersects with criminal law gives us an opportunity to think both about the animal movement and also about the impulse to use criminal law for social change. So Lori had asked me to talk a little bit about the history of the carceral turn in animal law. And I think it's really hard to do, right? I mean, you could go back a long ways and look at Massachusetts colonies and the like, but I wanted to just focus really quite contemporaneous on what has happened in recent decades and give a few examples. And in doing so, I don't intend to suggest that the animal movement is monolithic or that every animal lawyer is seeking retribution or incarceration. But I also think it would be a real mistake to sugarcoat or downplay the extent to which carceral impulses have been part of recent animal law. So to give a couple of examples, throughout the 1990s, I found more than a dozen articles by commentators and academics who called for a war on animal crime. And many of them didn't leave to the imagination what they were analogizing to, right? They were making a direct comparison to and kind of valorizing the war on drugs. They said, just as we're doing it on drugs, we can do it on animals, right? This idea that there was something good coming of that. In hindsight, that seems foolish, but I don't think the actual motivations for it changed, right? We were tied to this idea of a war on some crime. More recently, the enactment of felony laws and then harsher penalties in all 50 states was championed as a major victory for the movement. In just 2019, one of the largest organizations in the country described the enactment of a new felony law as, quote, a watershed moment in animal law, right? So this is not something that is old. It's not something that is fringe. Many of you have probably seen the slogan, abuse an animal, go to jail. And, you would say, well, maybe that's just rhetorical, right? We put lots of things on bumper stickers. But there is lots of evidence that it's not meant to be rhetorical, and it never was meant to be rhetorical. So to quote just one newsletter from 2006 on this point, it says, referring to our criminal justice program, it says, our program inspired the famous bumper sticker, abuse an animal, go to jail, and we mean it, right? And so it really wasn't meant to be this kind of, let's just talk about it and we'll sort of vent our visceral frustrations. It really was, we can advance the cause of animals if we incarcerate people, we prosecute people. And then just this week, and I apologize to my colleague who I took this from, I saw in the faculty mail room this Florida Bar Journal. I'm going to return it. I made a copy for Lori. It's not mine. I'm going to get the Florida, but I saw fish on the cover, and so I thought maybe it was about animal law. It turned out to be about water, but when I opened the table of contents, there was in fact an article about animal law. So I turned to the Florida Bar Journal. This is really happening just this week. And the title of the article is America's Unifying Banner, Erasing Animal Cruelty. So the article starts that in this time of political division, it's important to recognize that Americans still have values in common that unite us. And the article then goes through this idea that we are, as a country, not as far apart as we think because we care about animals. And the proof for that is that we have felonies, and we should take up arms to get more things like Connecticut has, and I think Lori and Michael might talk about a thing called Desmond's Law, right? So this article is actually, several pages arguing that Florida needs a version of Desmond's Law imminently, and Desmond's Law, as they'll explain, is sort of an idea of having a courtroom advocate, someone who would be in the court, helping out with prosecutions. And the rationale for these new advances and tying ourselves to criminal prosecutions and criminal innovations, the authors of this piece say, well, look, if we do this stuff, we gain the support not just of quote, animal welfare advocates, but also law enforcement. Right? So it is the animal lawyers, the animal movement, looking for approval from truly the carceral state, looking to have sanction and acclaim from law enforcement. And the question that kind of united many of the chapters in the book was this very question of what does the movement get, or why would we come behind this kind of rationale? How does this advance animal law? And I really would encourage you to look at some of the chapters. I mean, Aya Gruber, Ben Levin, Tammy Kennan have articles about the intersections of domestic violence and other interpersonal violence and animal crimes, and sort of the connections between the feminist war on crime and this turn in animal law that I think are really quite interesting. And part of what Lori and I were trying to do is bring sort of top legal scholars in immigration, and Doug wrote a chapter on torts and on domestic violence, who have never thought about animal issues, and to say, like, look at this thing that's happening in animal law, and what do you think about it? And I think that the chapters reflect a real awakening to the idea that, advocates in civil society and advocates who are thinking about the public good can't ignore animal law any longer, because it has become a force that is part of the mass incarceration movement. And that's one of the themes that picks up, is this sort of denial by the animal movement of complicity in mass incarceration is completely unfounded, that it's the rhetoric and it's the logics that are driving mass incarceration in the animal movement, sadly, as much as any other movement has been part of that. So you might say, well, but why, right? I mean, that's part of what we're talking about. Why would they do that? I mean, we're not evil people. We don't have malicious motivations. But that's true of most of what has, right? The path of mass incarceration was sort of paved with good intentions. Most people weren't, most incarcerations are not for drugs, they're not for random possession. It's through this desire to do good. And when it comes to animal law in particular, I would say there's this idea that we hope that it will reduce the infliction of animal harm, that fewer animals will be harmed. And there's kind of a folk psychology that regards, that sort of lionizes this link that everyone has heard of, right? The idea that persons will move from hurting humans, or move from hurting animals on to hurting humans. And this is, again, featured, almost half of this Florida Law Bar article is about how we are doing this to protect humans, not animals, right? It's a human-centric approach to thinking about animal law. So, again, I would just say, from a historical standpoint, this isn't new. It hasn't gone away. It's always been central. And so then I would just make two pretty quick final points about it and then turn it over. The first is that the logic underlying the criminal interventions in animal law aren't new, and they aren't particularly creative. They're, in fact, the same things that we've seen all over the criminal system. And so when I think about animal law, one of the things that excited me, even though I was working in other fields, as Doug mentioned, was that it has an innovative spirit. It has this sort of, idea that we can do something different in the world than has been done. And when I look at what's happening in criminal animal law, it's the same things that we see over and over again that have never worked and that have only created sort of hierarchies and systemic violence. So among some of the things that we flag in the book and that I worked on in my earlier projects, animal lawyers have invested in the name of advancing animals in projects of deportation, right? Aligning themselves with ICE to have persons removed from the country. Animal lawyers have worked and filed briefs to have juveniles treated as adults and incarcerated in adult prisons in the name of treating them as victims. There have been efforts to create mandatory minimums, to have no-drop prosecution policies. In just the last 2 months, I've seen an article calling for making sure that animal convictions can never be expunged from someone's record. They said that the expungement would do an injustice to the animal victim. And this article that I just mentioned from the Florida Bar Journal says, quote, "The gold standard in animal protection and abuse prevention would be an animal abuse registry." Right? So, I mean, these are ideas that, like, to some they seem antiquated. I mean, offender registries are, circa 2000 dated. Nobody thinks they work for their test case, which was sex offenders. But when it comes to animals, this week we're being told that they are the gold standard. But if we can't get that, we should at least have Desmond's law. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, there are lots of other things out there, lots of proposals. And I guess what I would end with is just saying, I don't think any of us who care about animals and want to be part of an animal protection movement can treat these ideas that are out there and have become centered in the conversations. I don't think there's space for us to be neutral on them. For too long I've heard people say, well, this hasn't been our position, or it isn't exactly what we do. And I don't think there's room for neutrality. I was telling Doug that just this morning I was reading a fantastic book by Benedict Boisseron called Afro Dog. And she has this phrase where she says, there's no room for neutrality when it comes to animals and religion. She says, because you can't just say I'm neutral about religion or eating animals, because if you don't care about it, then that means you probably don't believe in God. Or if you don't care about it and you eat animals, you're taking a position. There's no neutrality, like you invest in it or you don't invest in it. And I think that's true, the same is true in my mind of carceral animal law. It's out there, it is central, and we either confront it and figure out what we want from it, which is, do we want lower animal crimes? Are we trying to send a personhood signal by saying they're victims? We have to be very tangible about what we want the outputs to be. And if we don't, right, we can't just pretend that we're not taking a position on it, because it is part of the movement that has been centered over decades. And so to ignore it is, I think, part of this neutrality that doesn't exist. And I can tell you that, in the last several decades where this has been a fixation of the movement, we don't have any great data that suggests animals are doing better. In fact, by most measures, I don't know any to the contrary, but maybe there are some, so I won't say there are none. But by most measures, animals are doing worse than they were when we started the war on animal crime. And that goes even for the types of crimes that these do cover, right? The rates of animal crime are not down. They don't seem to be having a deterrent effect. So what do we want to obtain through these processes? What would that look like? And I'll just end by saying my research suggests, and I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer, that rather than just even imagining that it's neutral, I think that the focus on carceral animal law has been bad for humans and bad for animals. I think that there's a limited appetite for change. I think there's a limited legislative appetite for change. And when we press things like the PACT Act for felony animal cruelty, we limit our options to have other victories in the near term. So I will close there. Thanks.
Justin talked a little bit about the impetus for Carceral Logics, and I just want to emphasize that there is a sense in which the carceral turn, as it were, in animal protection is, for those of us who aren't animal lawyers, and I'm not, I'm a philosopher, it's really kind of shocking. And Mike and I have been doing this work trying to think of alternatives and become more and more shocked here in Connecticut by witnessing what is Desmond's law. So I want to talk a little bit about Desmond's law, the law that's being held up as the gold standard to try to sort of continue to protect animals. And maybe think about one of the things that Justin and Mike and I and others are working on is thinking of alternatives to this, because those of you who know me, I've been working for decades to protect animals. Animals cruelty is something that keeps me up at night, but actually cruelty to humans, particularly in prisons, also keeps me up at night. So the fact that somehow the animal movement got together with people who want to put people in prison makes me really sad. In 2012, a 22-year-old man named Alex Wohlert, white guy, strangled his dog Desmond. Oh, I should give a trigger warning. I'm going to talk about animal cruelty, so I'm sorry.
You're supposed to give it before.
I know, I forgot. I'm going to talk about animal cruelty. Sorry. So he strangled his dog Desmond. He had been abusing Desmond. He had a domestic issue. His partner left him with the baby they had, which was good, and brought the dog back to the shelter where they adopted Desmond from, and then the guy went back, Alex went back and got Desmond out and then abused Desmond and then ultimately killed Desmond, and he dumped Desmond's body in a plastic bag. And Desmond was found because he had been microchipped. So they found the dog and they found evidence of the violence that the dog had to endure. And so then they found Alex Wohlert, the young man who was abusing and ultimately killed Desmond. And he was charged with animal cruelty, and there were a number of hearings, there was a number of continuances, and more animal activists came together, in New Haven actually, to protest outside of the courthouse. They were seeking the maximum penalty for Alex Wohlert, which could have been 5 years in prison. And Alex was ultimately sentenced to accelerated rehabilitation. And the activists were pissed off. They really wanted him in prison. Some of them were yelling, some of them were crying, and then they began to organize for harsher penalties. And in 2016, so 4 years later, then Governor Malloy enacted Desmond's Law, which is the first law in the country that allows for these animal advocates to make statements in court and testify in the name of justice, but they're sort of there to testify for the animals. And one of the things that that I think Justin already talked about, but is really important, is the people, and Mike will talk about too, is that the people who are involved in this kind of carceral response, this sort of punitive response, often say this isn't really what we're not interested in punishment per se. We're not interested in retribution per se. But it's just not held up by their actions or the facts. And Mike will talk a little bit more about that. The law itself was sponsored by Diana Urban, and she said quite clearly that Desmond's law is designed to increase jail time. That was her a quote from her. So it isn't that you can't have it both ways. If you're going to go this route, you're going to follow the way that the law goes, and to make something a very serious crime, as Justin was just saying, you need to get it more, mandatory minimums and what have you. So this is what the Desmond's law has led to. And one of the things that I think is really important to understand is that these advocates are both appointed by the court-appointed animal advocates are court-appointed, and so they're just one person, usually an attorney or a law student. But they're followed around the state by these people, Mike and I call them the purple people, that have these purple shirts, these Desmond Army shirts on. And Mike will talk more about it, but they are really a force to be reckoned with. We followed a particular case, the case of Heidi Luter, and Heidi Luter's case was a very high-profile case. It was basically what happened, and again, a trigger warning. I'm going to say something sad about dogs. November 14th, 2018, police entered a Fairfield home that was being rented by Heidi Luter, who was at the time the president of Bully Breed Rescue. So she was involved in animal rescue. And one of the things that happened was she ended up, I think this is right, she got addicted to heroin? Yes. So she became a heroin addict and ended up leaving 5 dogs, 4 in cages and 1 in the bathroom, to starve, and they didn't have water. And when the police entered this home in November of 2018, the dogs had been rotting in their cages and 1 in the bathroom. They were
live dogs left in the house as well.
I don't think there were. I think she had them. Yeah. And the police found them just skin and bones with collars on, and the house was trashed, and there was all of this awful, drug paraphernalia and all sorts of other things. It was really disgusting. And one of the detectives, actually, who spoke to Luters when she turned herself in 2 months later, reported that she herself was feeling terrible, and she had just come out of a rehab facility, and she called herself horrible and claimed she heard the animals barking in her head. So she felt really bad for the dogs, but at the same time, she also lied to her supporters. She said that the 4 dogs who died in those cages were at a sanctuary, and the 5th dog was being sheltered somewhere, but they were all actually dead. Miko, Buddha, Brooklyn, Gunner, and Achilles, the Fairfield 5, they were dubbed by Desmond's Army, were really upset about this. And so I'm going to just sort of skip ahead a little bit. So the trial actually occurred. She opted for a bench trial, which we both think was probably a good move on her part. Her attorney was a good attorney. And what ended up happening was that because the dogs' bodies were so decomposed, there was no way to show how they died, which still baffles me. So she was charged with 10 counts of animal cruelty, including 5 felony counts of maliciously killing an animal, but she was not found guilty on any of those charges. Instead, she was found guilty on 1 count of criminal property damage to the rental home, which was trashed, for sure. So interestingly, this is one of the funny things about the nature of animal law, is that one of the ideas is that we need to elevate the status of animal cruelty so that we elevate the status of animals themselves. Animals are understood to be property, and we don't want animals to be thought of as property. We want them to be treated, the idea is that they should be treated as beings who have lives to live on their own. They should be understood to be victims of crime when they are suffer in these kinds of ways. But it turns out in court that in this particular case, they could not figure out that she actually was responsible for their deaths. There could have been, what did the judge say?
No, it was just, they couldn't prove cause of death. And under the statute, you have to prove that.
There was a reasonable doubt, yeah,
Death,
right.
claimed it, and they couldn't prove it.
They couldn't prove that she caused the death. So it ended up that she was just guilty of damaging this property, just the property.
They
And
used the animals to do it though, remember that? The animals' bodies.
were part of the,
Caused the destruction.
part of the, yeah, that's right. Part of the damage was the rotting dog's body. Sorry about that. So when the not guilty verdict was announced, some members of Desmond's armies, again, were crying, but as Mike reported, they remained really orderly, and we'll say more about their orderliness, but they weren't orderly online. And this is one of the things that I want to highlight. So Zilla Kanamela, who's the president of Desmond's army, and a number of them wrote outrageously violent things. But this is a quote from Zilla, who, again, is from Desmond's army. "I don't know why the state saw fit to put an inexperienced trial lawyer, assistant state attorney on an egregious case. I suppose it was one that was hard to screw up. Well, guess what? Not only did you present the case with zero passion, you may have well been talking about cardboard. You threw the lives of 5 innocent souls away like a balled up piece of paper on your desk. You had a world of resources at your fingers. Did you use any of them? The prosecution's detective office? I know you have one. Sure as shit didn't appear to be used. Not one neighbor interviewed, not one vet contacted. The list of opportunities missed to get justice is too long to list. No mention of caretaker responsibility, not once. Hell, you didn't even know the case, even though it's been sitting on your desk for 2 years. I can tell you one thing. This was so much more egregious than your rookie fuck-up. This could have been a slam dunk case if you only did your due diligence. Get out of the business where innocent lives are concerned. Go be a goddamn tax lawyer somewhere. That cardboard actually is cardboard, and you don't need to have an iota of passion or compassion. Dead fish don't belong in the justice system." So this, I think, is a really telling way of thinking about this Desmond's army. There's this fish, right? So I think this idea is really interesting, and it wasn't simply online and an attack on the prosecutor. It was also an attack on the defense attorney. Mike will talk about that. It was also somewhat of an outrageous set of very frightening kinds of claims that people were making to others who were interested in the case. I think I was pretty intimidated. Mike will talk about the way that that he was treated. It's really quite peculiar that this is thought to be people who have compassion and compassion for animals and think that they can use the criminal justice system to sort of enhance that compassion, to use the law as a way of improving and enhancing compassion when they themselves are really quite frightening. And what's also really interesting is that the animal movement is lifting up these people as examples of really great activists to follow. And so the Animal Legal Defense Fund has a new video out. Well, it's not so new now, it's about a year, right? And it really highlights how important the activist work has been, and I think really not aware of the message that these activists are sending to regular people, other animal activists, and what have you. So ultimately, I'm going to just sort of quickly sort of give you the end story. So basically, Heidi Luters was not sentenced to any animal cruelty. I mean, she was not charged with any, she was not found guilty of any animal cruelty. She is responsible for paying back $190,000 to the landlord because the house was trashed. She was sentenced to 5 years, but it was suspended after she serves 15 months to allow her to work to get the money to pay back the landlord who lost the money. And it was an interesting decision that the judge made. He did say during the sentencing announcement that those dogs who died were left to rot, were left to decay, were left to diminish in their cages, in which an animal should be able to find some comfort, and it's horrific. However, she wasn't found guilty on those particular charges. She's currently out on bond pending appeal. And I don't know, I looked, I didn't see an appeal. Yeah. So these CAP programs, as Justin mentioned, are springing up around the country, and they're gaining a lot of publicity. They provide an outlet for angry animal advocates, and Mike will say a little bit more about that, I hope. But we're trying to think about alternatives, not alternatives that don't hold animal abusers accountable, but non-carceral alternatives. And one way of thinking about that, we're in the midst of thinking about that, but it's possible that when people are exposed to caring, empathetic ways of perceiving other animals, when they come to understand animals as sensitive and complex relational beings who obviously suffer when they're kept in cages and their psychological well-being isn't promoted, they may change their attitude and alter their behavior. And I think that this is a really important thing to be thinking about. A lot of the ways in which animals are treated cruelly is based on a misunderstanding of what an animal life is like and what the value of that animal life is. Sometimes it's also based on fear, and in this case that I was just talking about, the Heidi Lutter case, it's based on, a sort of misfortunate situation with drugs. Accelerated rehabilitation, which is the sentence that Alex Woolert received after killing Desmond, might be a place to start. And this is actually something that Justin and I have been talking to animal control people about. There's actually, the animal control people are quite interested in also thinking about anti-carceral responses to animal cruelty. In fact, I was really amazed to see some of the animal control officers, big old white guys, kind of old guys, like in Colorado or something weird like that, saying, saying like things like, yeah, I didn't have to write it. I didn't have to write this person up. I could just give this person some advice. I didn't have to write this person up. I could take the dogs and get them neutered so that the dogs don't jump the fence all the time. I can go fix the fence. All of these things that would really be helpful. So the animal control folks who do see their job, they see their job as their community safety and protecting animals as well, and community safety, are really interested in thinking beyond the carceral. So one can imagine, and I invite you to be thinking about this, one can imagine requiring participation in animal cruelty prevention and education programs, if the program involves some sort of serious community work rather than just filling on online forums or watching videos. Animal lawyers who seek to promote greater awareness of the plight of animals may wish to direct their attentions, I would argue, to the content of these programs rather than to trying to push for some of these more sort of carceral responses. Someone who's fatally cruel to an animal may not do such a thing again if they're locked up, because they can't, right? But they might not have changed their attitudes at all. And if they do get out, which hopefully they will, they're not going to be in any sense rehabilitated vis-a-vis animals. I think there's some really interesting ways of thinking differently about how we might intervene in the process. Now, one of the things that I thought Justin would talk about, we didn't talk about, is there's also a very significant problem with hoarding, and hoarding is another case that we've been following. And hoarding cases are more like negligence cases, and in these cases there's obvious kinds of solutions for help rather than bringing the people who are quote unquote hoarding into the criminal justice system. So I think that's another way to go, and also the other issue that we wanted to talk about and mention as an alternative is a lot of people end up being charged with animal cruelty, which is really just neglect, because they can't afford to take care of the animal that they might very much love. And so one of the other ways that this movement towards recognizing animals within the law might be able to shift is to try to intervene in a defensive posture to try to provide care and financial help and veterinary help for people who can't otherwise afford it.
So I guess when I came into this project, I came in and my task was to figure out how the animal advocate operated within Connecticut courtroom, right? And I think I got some startling findings. things. Right? It seems like, Desmond's army, which is this, I guess a natural outgrowth of this punitive culture that we have, right? And so I think what I noticed is that Desmond's army has like, a lot of pull, I would call it, in the prosecutor's office. So they put pressure on the prosecutor. So the state attorneys are under pressure. So we talked about Heidi's case, and the overcharging in that case is probably, having to do with Desmond's army and, them having some type of reach within the prosecutor's office. So, I was there clandestine. I listened, I recorded, I engaged. And so like the first day I went in, I went into the Heidi Lewis trial, and I was trying to identify players. And so, you go into the courtroom, and it's traditionally, the defense is on one side, the state is on one side, and then, supporters are on those sides. So I made the mistake of approaching two women that were on the defense side. Come to find out, they were just Army members in plain clothes, right? And so, so that I blew my cover that first day. And so it was like the next hearing, it was people will be looking at me and be whispering because they know that, they have affiliated me with Heidi, and, the temperature in the room is just so much animosity, right? That, anybody that's identified as sympathizing, supporting, anything, it's, a lot of aggression or whatever. And so, I kind of felt, scared, right? Because you never know what's gonna happen. You go outside of court, maybe somebody wants to attack you because they feel like, you support Heidi or you feel like she did do something wrong or whatever. And so that was the kind of the situation I was working under. And it's interesting that you said that prior to Desmond's law, there was this call for a war, right? And so they're named Desmond's army, right? And then they come in to the courtroom, and it's like they it's clear that they have a command structure because they listen to one person, one guy in particular, and based on what you said, this woman is the president putting out statements, so he may answer to her or some other people may answer, but it's one thing is clear when they're in the courtroom, you have members who are understandably hostile, angry, or whatever, but they're counseled by this individual prior to going in. He says, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so they go in, and it seems to be like everybody's cordial and everybody's nice, but that's not really the case. I interviewed Heidi, and it came out in the interview that she didn't have any supporters in the courtroom because they were threatened by Desmond's army. So now you have a person in court alone for that reason, right? Let me look at my notes here so I don't forget anything.
One of the things that happened at the sentencing, right outside, remember? That woman said to Sarah Finovitz.
Oh yeah. All right. So that's another one, right? Even her attorney was like accosted outside by old white woman approached him, and she says, you're the guy that represents that bitch, or something to that effect. And so there was a showdown between them. He called the police on her and stuff like that. But this is the type of situation, right? We had even the attorney pre-trial moving to exclude them from the courtroom, right? And so like Justin was saying, this thing has a lot of implications because now you're talking about free speech, right? Because if you say Desmond's army members can't come into the courtroom, what kind of message is that sending, right? And it kind of segues into like another thing that I noticed in there was like the courtroom, right? It really is a white space, right? I go in and sometimes I'm dressed like I'm dressed now, sometimes I'm dressed like the average Joe, right? And I go in, and so you have court personnel, they'll be asking me like, are you a reporter? Or, they want to know why I'm there. Like, so it's like, why do you want to know why I'm here? This is a public space, right? One day I was in the courtroom and I was taking notes, and the marshal comes up to me and he says, you can't be taking notes. And I'm on. So I looked at him like, this is a public space. Like, that's the first thing you learn. Like, this is the public square. I can come in here, I can write, and I can listen. And so, I kind of, me being the person I am, I said to him, I said, this is a public space. And he said, well, you can't do it. And the court was in session. The judge is on the bench. The arguments are going on or whatever, because it's arraignment. And so I told him, I said, listen, I'm going to stop. But when I leave here and I come out, I want to see it in writing. So, he waits and he comes back a little later and he's telling me about, that was one of his previous supervisor's rules, and that's not the rule anymore. So, I went back to taking my notes and stuff, right? But, so another thing, like, that I saw that was, like, bad here was court personnel also, like, they're on that other side too, right? But depending on what their views are. And, most people believe that hurting animals are wrong. So court personnel, I would like that. One day I went in and one marshal, had the whole itinerary on, like, the attorney that, this is what she told me. She was like, she asked me why I was there, if I knew where I was going. I said, yeah, I'm here to observe. It wasn't Heidi Luer's trial, it was Joanne Connolly, right? And so she started to tell me, well, she has such and such for her attorney. He's a big big shot in Hartford. He doesn't do his such and such cases until in the AM. In the PM. So she's telling me, like, 2 o'clock. And that was interesting to me, because it's like it's this circus atmosphere where everybody's waiting for the spectacle, because she's telling me, yeah, she's gonna, she's gonna be, her transport truck is coming at this time. So they knew everything, and everything's all worked out, right? And so that, that kind of access I saw even more with Desmond's argument, because the first time I went to Joanne's case, I was waiting around, right? And because it's arraignment, you don't know when the defendant is going to be arraigned. So I'm sitting there waiting. I got there early and I waited. And then I saw, someone from the gallery talk to, the Army people, and then they left. So I sat and I waited. And then they came back, and then the case was called. So I put 2 and 2 together. I said, okay, they got someone in the state's attorney's office telling them, you don't have to wait around and inconvenience yourself. You can come back at this time. So it's kind of like, they work hand in hand. And I also witnessed one day, they taunted Joanne Connolly, right? They were taunting her, and she took her phone, and I think she must have snapped a picture or a video or whatever. And then so they immediately, ran over to the marshal and then finked on her. They told the marshal that she did such and such, and then the marshal, he came right over and started berating her about, not taking, recording anything inside the courtroom, right? It wasn't, did you do this or anything? It was immediately, don't do this. You were doing this, don't do it, right? And so that kind of showed me that, yeah, it's like the third prosecutor in the room when you're dealing with the advocate and, their minions, I would call them, right? They all work in concert, and it doesn't seem like, it doesn't represent an impartial system.
And just to say that Joanne Connolly case is one of the 40 cases that we were watching. Yeah.
Thank you.
I guess it's me.
It's you.
Well, thank you guys for coming, Stan. It's interesting because on any given day in the courthouse, you imagine if you come somewhere to speak, you should have 50 people or 60 people or 70 people show up. But the truth is, you go into the courthouse and you got 12 attorneys, you got 4 attorneys, and they are literally deciding what might happen in somebody's life. So I'm going to talk about a few things and then open it up for questions. I had a groundhog who was harassing me, and nobody's laughing because y'all think it's okay that I'm supposed to just let the groundhog eat my tomatoes and damage the infrastructure of my house. And it's this real question of what am I supposed to do with this groundhog? And I let it ride for a little while, imagining that it would recognize that this was my property and it didn't belong here. I got a little dog. the dog runs out into the street to chase the groundhog smell, and I thought that might scare it. I'd let the dog pee around the house, thinking it would make things better. It didn't. I saw these 2 giant holes leading under my house. And the thing is, like, you could have your whole house ruined by an animal deciding, not a bear, we have bears in Connecticut too. I'm just talking about a groundhog. And you can have a groundhog ruin your whole house because it has dug a system of tunnels, and not just a tunnel, but a fucking system. And the groundhog is intelligent. It always has an entry and an exit. It's never just one hole. It's always multiple holes. And you're probably wondering, where am I going with this? Well, I called animal control, and they told me that they don't deal with these kinds of issues. And I was like, what kinds of issues exactly are you talking about? And they said, we don't deal with issues that aren't covered by the money that the state pays us to deal with. For instance, if you hit a deer in your backyard, you can call us and we will remove the deer. And I was like, with my car? And they was like, we'll arrest you as well because we don't know why you will be driving in your backyard. Completely bothered me. I had to call a local pest control person to come and get the groundhog. And he came and he said, look, I'm going to set up a trap. And I said, that trap looks like a cage. And I thought about my friend Alec Karakastanis, who always calls prison cells cages. And I was like, that does not remind me of a prison cell. That's a fucking cage. And I was like, cool, do you have another cage? That made me feel bad. But like I said, the groundhog was messing up my life, and I wanted him removed. So he tells me to check the cage every day. I check it today, and I saw something that was like grayish, right? It was in a cage. I didn't want to get close to it because I didn't want to fully identify it. Luckily, I had my cell phone on, and I was able to zoom in to pretend like I got close to the cage for the guy. And he was like, I don't know, I think it's a raccoon. Pissed me off.
Oh, you're scared, bro.
I was like, yeah, no, I don't like raccoons. So he comes, and this was my real test. He comes, and he says, oh, it's a opossum. Except Larry Levis has taught me in a poem that an opossum can mangle a man's hands in 30 seconds. And so the man says, do you want me to let it go or take it with me? What the fuck you think? And then because I'm halfway intelligent, I say, I don't know, I think they might be good for the earth. I was lying. I didn't think that shit at all, right? He's like, no, they are. They eat ticks. You know, they are good. I was like, all right, let it go. And then I told him where the groundhog comes, he sets out these 2 traps. He has his gloves on that he uses when he deals with animals. And he takes a piece of fruit. He's like, yo, I'm using my lunch for this. I was like, damn, that's real generous of you. I wish I had something to offer you. I had a whole house with food in it, but, you know, I was being rhetorical. So he throws the fruit in there. And then I'm about to leave for this, and I see this giant groundhog in a cage. And part of me got sad. And then the other part of me says, I'm going to shower, then I'm going to think about what I should do. I shower. I call the guy. I said, it's a groundhog. We caught him. He says, all right, I can't get back there to tomorrow. They actually got a law. Most of the trappers, they have to take the trap up on Friday because they don't check the traps on the weekend. And they can't kill the groundhog. They're going to release it in East Rock Park so that he could catch you on your run, right? But he was like, would I put a tarp over the cage so that, you know, he doesn't like get sick and he doesn't, I don't know, apparently you can just go crazy in a cage. I don't know. You go crazy in a cell too. But the point is that it was the burden is on me, and this is why after I leave here, I'm going to rush home to throw a tarp over this giant groundhog. But why am I telling this story? It's a giant groundhog. But why am I telling this story? It turns out that there's this whole system of rules that's supposed to govern how you deal with a pest that you don't even want in your life. And if you violate that system of rules, you get punished by the law. Now, nobody acknowledges you when you follow that system of rules. And in fact, you only know the system of rules if you engage with somebody who is conscientious enough to let you know. He could have just told me to leave the groundhog in a cage. I'm connecting this to some work I did at the Public Defender's Office, and I'll end with a story about what I think about cruelty. I worked in the Public Defender's Office here, and one of my first cases was this young girl who had moved from one apartment, and she left her dog there, and the dog died. And the truth is that you never know the circumstances of any crime. You know, you hear everybody discussing what happened when they weren't there as if as if this is Sherlock Holmes or like one of these TV shows where somehow they could piece together exactly what happened. And my client tells me that she moved, and then there was a snowstorm, and then her car broke down, and the prosecutor was like, that can't be true, because the prosecutor has a new car that doesn't break down, and the prosecutor also has insurance, and they also have a rental car service that you could get if your car does break down. But this young woman didn't have any of those things, and she was leaving the apartment where she was renting from her uncle, and she left, and her uncle was like, you're leaving, you're not paying your rent. You know your dog isn't here dead, I'm gonna call the police. He didn't actually call the police. In New Haven, when you take a dog, a dead animal, to animal control, they are the police, right? And so they called her, they arrested her. And what was fascinating is in New Haven, they got this thing called pretrial, it's like a pretrial conference. And it's the defense attorney and the prosecutor and the judge. Now, because the prosecutors and the public defenders are all on the same, like within the same different like law firms, I could hear a case with two other public defenders, and a prosecutor was within the same group of prosecutors can also hear a case. So I hear every case that comes up before mine. It was this dude that raped the kid. He didn't rape the kid. He fondled the kid in a public swimming pool. It was a woman who was working. I still remember these other people's charges because it's so profoundly just fucked up the way I think about animal rights law. It was a woman who was a in-home aide for an older woman, stole all her jewelry. It's like 70 grand worth of jewelry, 80 grand worth of jewelry, stole all her stuff, sold it, and she got prosecuted for it. I distinctly remember the judge giving her a 7-year sentence, suspending it, and the prosecutor was so mad and was like, can I at least get restitution? And the judge said, I'm not going to put restitution on this woman because she can't afford to pay you. So all you're going to do is try to use the restitution as a way to incarcerate her again later. If you want the money, take her to civil court, where incarceration is not going to be a penalty. I thought this is a decent judge. He played the dude that was fondling the child down to like some kind of accelerated rehabilitation. He got like some kind of suspended sentence. He didn't go to prison. It's time for my client, and my client, again, I get it, the dog died, but I had a compelling narrative. I think the woman had 2 children that were in diapers, right? I thought I had a compelling narrative. I tell the story to the judge, and the judge says, all right, I'll agree to a year suspended after 7 months. I was like, you're not fucking taking that. The thing is, you're not supposed to curse at a judge. And so my supervisor and attorney like elbows me, and you're not supposed to decline an offer without presenting it to your client. But I was just thinking, you must have lost your mind. What I didn't realize is this was 2017, so this is post-Desmond's law. And so usually when you go to pretrial, you have several pretrials before it's over. The judge looks at me and says, you know what, I'm going to kick it to the chief judge. I'm not even dealing with this anymore. Now, mind you, usually you go 2, 3, 4 rounds of negotiations before you try to get to a point. I go to the other judge. The judge is a woman. This is 2 months later. I remember telling her the story. She has 2 children. I know she has 2 children. I know she has 2 daughters, just like my client. I am thinking of this no way. And I'm not going to say anything else about the judge because she's a friend of mine, and everybody will know who I'm talking about if I said it. But let's just say I plead the case, right? And the judge says, yeah, that was a harsh penalty. I'll give you 1 year suspended after 5 months. And I'm like, man, y'all got to be out of y'all fucking mind. This time, my supervisor and attorney takes me out into the hallway, and it's like, you cannot talk to people like that. I was like, you can't tell me how to fucking talk to people. Like, and I'm so upset, because I'm like, this woman has 2 children, and you just offer her 5 months in prison for this dog. And I'm saying it was an accident. Or I'm saying we don't know if it was an accident, but it sounds like it was an accident. And this is where the baseline of the conversation started. What I think is interesting, though, is like the overlap between understanding what happens when we think about the only opportunity for relief as prison. The overlap in what happens in this narrative is that in the same way we don't fully understand what happens to a person that goes to prison for a drug case, for a robbery case, for an assault case, for a murder case. It's the same way that we don't know what happens when somebody goes in front of a court for cruelty to animals case. And we try to justify it because we think that the harm that's done to an animal is predictive of some harm that is going to be done to another person. But I would say the hardest thing, and this is why I admire what Michael did, the hardest thing is that we pretend like this is like central in anybody's mind. Most of us don't go into the courthouse and watch it. And there are no people in the courthouse, actually. You have the marshals, you have the prosecutor, you have the defense attorneys, and if it's a domestic violence case, you have some family. But most of the time, the courtroom is sparse. And so, especially in a case like this, my client never had anybody showing up for her. And finally, the last thing I'll say is I was supposed to say something about cruelty in prison, but I think the cruelty happens before prison. I think that I don't even blame the marshals for trying to impose the rules on us. I've done court watching. I've taught classes here. I taught an ethnography class here where I made all of my students go and court watch and take notes. I don't even blame the marshals because the marshals are your typical blue-collar workers who are doing jobs that nobody else would really do. I don't even blame Desmond's army. They're just like regular folks who have no sense of how to manage and think about their own power. I blame the prosecutors who deeply understand that it's an absurdity when we could be sitting in a room together and this dude has been fondling little children's genitals, right? And he gets a suspended sentence. And you fix your face to say that my client should spend 7 months in jail for a dog. And I have a dog. My dog is lovely most of the time. My dog bit me twice. If I would have said, let's put this motherfucking dog in a cage for 2 years for biting me, nobody would have been like, you know what, that makes sense. That is a just punishment for your dog tearing your flesh. Now, if the dog would have did it twice, they would have killed the dog. But my point is, it's like a thwarted, a mixed up way, a confused way in which we understand what punishment should look like. And I think that, it is not actually productive to think about the jailers as being the source of the inhumane conditions that happen when you get incarcerated. It is not the jailers who are the source for the inhumane penalties people face when they go into the court. It is actually the people. And more than Desmond's army motivating the responses, I actually think that it's the public who is going to, be easily ginned up by Desmond's army, who is going to be unwilling to make the counter argument to why incarceration isn't an effective response to like the death of an animal. And then actually there's the public who we haven't, been imaginative enough to articulate a vision of the world that helps me even understand how my client, left her dog. And I know how she left her dog in the apartment, though. She had 2 kids. She had a broken down car. And it literally takes like 8 hours for a dog to die of, not having any drink. They're going to die more quickly of not having anything to drink than they will of not having food. But you only know that when you know people whose dogs have died. You literally will not, like if you ask all of your classmates, how long will it take a dog to die without water? They will say, well, I once went 2 days without water. So I think my dog could last a day, and it's just not true. So we should have questions because you guys have sat for quite some time listening to us talk.